What if Ned Stark's execution didn't break the North, but awakened it? What if that single swing of Ilyn Payne's sword became more than a political act? What if it became a sacrifice, a holy one? They said the North remembers, but no one expected how violently it would. Ned Stark's death didn't silence the wolves, it sanctified them. When the Raven reached Winterfell, the Maester had barely whispered the news before Catelyn dropped to her knees in the Godswood. She didn't scream, she didn't sob, she just stared at the heart tree, as though waiting for it to speak. Robb stood behind her, fists clenched, jaw trembling, eyes burning, not with grief, with belief. He died with the old gods watching, Robb said that night. They saw a Stark beheaded for honor. Not ambition, not treason, honor. He didn't speak again for hours. When he did, his words changed everything. Then the old gods demand blood in return. No one argued. They didn't need to. In the North, religion wasn't a temple or a sept. It was in the wind, the trees, the bones. And Ned's death had stirred something ancient, something that remembered when the first men sacrificed to weirwoods with blood, not just prayer. And so it began. Robb wasn't declared king in the North. He was declared the chosen fang, the first sword of the old gods, and this wasn't a rebellion. It was a holy war. Bring me the Septons first, Robb had said weeks later, when the Ravens returned from the south full of threats and lies. And burn the statues of the Seven in my lands. They were blind when my father died. We'll give them no place to watch our vengeance. Winterfell changed. Men carved new symbols beside the old direwolf sigils, ancient glyphs half forgotten. Women whispered prayers in the woods at night. The silent sisters fled north, fearing what the Stark boy had awakened. But it was the small folk who changed first. They called Ned Stark the martyr of the weirwood. Children began pressing bloodied palms to heart trees in honor of him. Crops were buried with wolf bones for blessings. The North had always been proud, but now it was something else. It was possessed. Riverrun welcomed Robb not as a general but as a prophet. Catelyn didn't understand it at first. She loved her son, but this wasn't her Robb. He didn't weep for his father. He knelt in blood beside a carved tree and said, "I feel him here." She watched northern soldiers sharpen their swords while humming old songs, ones about skin changers, red snow and vengeance under moonlight, and it terrified her. Not because it was madness, but because it wasn't. They were winning not through numbers or alliances, through faith. Every time they took a castle, they built a shrine to Ned. They didn't loot. They didn't rape. They converted. The gods of the South did nothing when the wolf died, the soldiers would say. But the North watches, always. Tyrion Lannister, upon hearing the whispers of religious uprisings in the North, laughed at first. Starks and sermons. What's next? Hound priests and nightly crows. But the laughter died quickly, because the North wasn't sending ravens. It was sending heads. Theon Greyjoy was the first to see it in the flesh. He rode north thinking of conquest, found only silence and eyes in the trees. When he entered Winterfell, the snow whispered to him, and by nightfall, he was bleeding beneath the godswood. Robb didn't flinch when he saw his childhood friend's body. He spat on the house of my father, he told the crowd. Let his blood water the roots of justice. The crowd didn't cheer. They bowed. Arya heard about the holy war from the whispers of travelers. She didn't believe it at first, until she saw a man with a carved wolf burned into his chest, kneeling beside a weirwood, whispering Ned's name like a prayer, "Father." She whispered. The first time in years she said the word. The Brotherhood without banners debated whether the North had gone mad. Beric Dondarrion, undead and bound to R'hllor, felt something strange stirring in the snow-covered winds. "Fire and ice," he muttered once. "And ice has found its god." Jon Snow, still at the wall, began to feel it too. The old gods didn't speak in words, but in dreams. He saw his father every night, silent, watching, bleeding at the base of the heart tree. And in his dream, Jon stood beside Robb, not in armor, but in furs, eyes glowing like moonlight on snow. The Night's Watch forbade politics. But even brothers began asking, if the North rides for its gods, should we stay out of it? Maester Aemon said nothing. But when he was alone, he opened old texts about the first men, and wept. "Something old has awakened," he said once to Sam, "and I fear it does not sleep again." Meanwhile, King's Landing grew nervous. Joffrey, arrogant as ever, mocked the frozen fanatics. But Cersei saw the letters, heard the stories and realized This wasn't rebellion. It was a crusade. And holy wars didn't end with treaties, they ended with fire, or winter. Stannis Baratheon, when told about the northern movement, nodded slowly. They found their god, he said. I already have mine. But even Melisandre looked northward with hesitation. The fire dims there, she admitted, as if swallowed by an older shadow. Back in the Riverlands, Robb began wearing wolf pelts not as armor, but as vestments. He spoke less, prayed more, and when he rode into battle he carried a blade named Winter's Will, said to be cooled in the blood of traitors and blessed beneath the oldest tree in the north. The Lannisters didn't fear it, until they heard how it sang. The sword made no sound. But men who heard it said they dreamed of wolves and snow and blood. Catelyn watched her son grow harder. Less boy, more myth. She feared he'd become like Stannis until she saw the look in his eyes when he held her hand. There was still love there, but it was love buried beneath a purpose deeper than crowns. Robb didn't want the Iron Throne. He wanted judgment, and he wanted it for every Southern lord who watched Ned die and did nothing. I won't sit on the Iron Throne, he told his bannermen once, but I'll bury it beneath snow and silence if I must. And they believed him. The Karstarks built a temple entirely of bone, and Clyce the Manderleys executed 3 southern merchants for refusing to kneel to Ned's shrine. And the Boltons, well, the Boltons were silent, too silent. But in Dreadfort, Ramsay began flaying southern prisoners and calling it sacrifice. He claimed to worship the old gods now. But the weirwoods bled tears when he spoke. Even the trees knew. His god was his own cruelty. Jon Snow, after another dream of Ned Stark bleeding in the snow, wrote a letter. Brother, he began, if you still are, tell me what you've become. Robb never answered, but instead he sent a direwolf pelt with Ned's broken chain embedded in it, a message, a memory, a warning. Far to the south, the High Septon began denouncing the false gods of the north. He held mass prayers against the weirwoods, and 3 days later, his sept burned in the night. No witnesses, no proof, just ashes and a tree carved into the stone, silently watching. And then the snow began to fall. In the Riverlands, too early, too cold. Winter was coming, but it wasn't alone anymore. It had faith, it had fury, and it had wolves. Fury, and it had wolves. The snow in the Riverlands wasn't just weather anymore. It was omen. It came fast, unseasonal, and unnatural. Crops wilted, roads froze. Horses refused to move through drifts that piled up overnight. Some said it was just climate. Others, especially those who fought for the north, began to whisper, "The gods are moving." Robb Stark stood atop the walls of Riverrun, his cloak blowing like a banner. Around him, warriors stood silent, watching the snow fall like a blessing. Their armor was no longer polished with southern oils or decorated with sigils of vanity. It was plain. It was cold, painted with ash, blood, and sometimes weirwood sap. 1,000 voices called him king, but he never once wore a crown. In a chamber below, Catelyn paced. Her hands trembled. She had seen the North Wind battles, but this was something deeper, darker. She had pleaded with Robb the night before. "They are following you like you're a god," she said. "No," he answered quietly. "Like I serve one." "Then who speaks for the living?" she asked. "The dead do," he replied, and Catelyn had no answer for that. At Harrenhal, Tywin Lannister studied the war not with maps, but with fire. He burned old northern texts, confiscated every shrine, executed anyone who invoked Ned Stark's name as more than just a traitor. But the fear spread. Spies returned with stories of children cutting their palms beneath heart trees, of women throwing their stillborns into frozen rivers to feed the gods, of shrines built from bones and cloaked in wolf pelts, and behind it all, a Stark, not just a king, but a symbol. Jaime returned from a scouting mission with cuts on his face and fury in his voice. "They're not fighting like soldiers," he spat. "They're fighting like zealots. No fear, no surrender. They'd rather die in snow than live in sun." And it was true. The North had found something worse than rage, conviction, Arya. Now hiding in the shadows of Westeros, followed the ripples of her brother's holy war like a phantom. She didn't know what she believed anymore, but when she slipped into taverns and heard songs about the bleeding father and the flame-eyed wolf, she knew something had changed. Even the faceless men had noticed. When she returned to the House of Black and White for a time, the kindly man asked her, "What stirs in your homeland?" She replied without blinking, "Justice." He frowned. Justice and faith are twin blades. One cuts the guilty, the other cuts everything. In the Riverlands, Robb's forces took castle after castle, not with brutality, but with eerie grace. Before battle, they prayed in silence. Afterward, they buried the dead, even enemies, beneath the trees, and in every conquered holdfast, a single message was carved into wood or stone: Ned Stark watches. King's Landing began to spiral. Joffrey's cruelty grew more erratic. He ordered statues of the old gods burned in the streets, forced northern hostages to dance in wolfskins before executing them. Tyrion watched it all with horror. "You're not making them fear us," he warned. "You're making them believe they're right." Cersei didn't care. "They believe in snow and trees," she snapped. "We have wildfire, but wildfire doesn't stop a storm." The faith of the Seven began cracking too. Some Septons fled south. Others were found drowned in wells, their mouths stuffed with wolf fur. No one could prove it was the North. But everyone knew, and through it all Robb remained silent. When questioned, he simply knelt. He spoke only in war councils, and even then, rarely. It wasn't that he'd lost himself, it was that he'd become more. He wasn't Robb anymore. He was the Stormfang, a vessel. Their prophecy, and his bannermen didn't just follow, they obeyed. Rose Bolton, watching all of this unfold, began to reconsider his own games. He had planned betrayal. He always did. But something about this war felt different. Even he feared what might happen if he stood in the path of a holy tide. Ramsay didn't care. He flayed in private, claiming it was for the gods. But when a heart tree in the Dreadfort began bleeding real blood after one such act, even he stepped back. The tree burned that night. By morning, 3 Bolton men were found hanging from its ashes. Their eyes were torn out. Jon Snow, still bound to the wall, felt the pull stronger with each passing day. Ghost growled at night. The wind carried whispers, and Jon began praying to the old gods without realizing it. "I don't know what you want," he said to the trees, "but I know he didn't die for nothing." And somewhere in the dark, something listened. Maester Aemon fell ill, and before he lost consciousness, he gripped Sam's hand and whispered, "It's happening again." The fire falls. The snow rises, and then he died. Back in the south, Stannis finally marched. Melisandre's flames showed her wolves drowning, lions in a sea of white. She smiled. Ice burns brighter than we thought. But Stannis didn't smile. "This isn't Fire's War anymore," he muttered. "It's something else." And then came the massacre at the Crossroads Inn. 200 Lannister riders, including 3 Goldcloaks, were found butchered, heads turned north, mouths sewn shut. No banners were raised, but the trees nearby bled red, and someone had carved a wolf into the stone floor of the inn. Using fingernails, Tyrion ordered ravens to every major house. "This isn't rebellion," he wrote. "This is religion. And it's winning." Catelyn watched her son kneel before a dying soldier and offer him a drink of melted snow. She remembered when Robb couldn't even hold his sword properly. Now his hands glowed red with blood, and his eyes with something ancient. "You're not my son anymore," she whispered that night in the tent. Robb turned to her. "I am," he said. "I just hear them now." She didn't ask who, because deep down she already knew, and somewhere in the darkest forests of the north, Bran Stark opened his eyes beneath the roots of the world, and the trees began to whisper. Vengeance is not over. Not yet. Not over. Not yet. Bran's dreams were no longer dreams. They were doors! He didn't walk through them. He slipped like falling into a river made of memory and blood. Sometimes he was his father, standing in the dungeons of King's Landing. Sometimes he was a wolf, teeth soaked in crimson. And other times he was the tree itself, its roots tangled around bones, its sap pulsing with the rage of 1,000 winters. He saw Robb, his brother, standing in snow, speaking words not taught by maesters, but whispered by winds older than fire. Bran didn't understand it all. But he knew one thing. Ned Stark's death had changed more than the fate of a kingdom. It had awakened something ancient, and it was flowing through the veins of the north like frostfire, and it was spreading. At the Twins, House Frey received no raven, only silence. They expected Robb would march south and beg for the crossing. Instead, his army encircled them silently, like wolves around an old stag. Walder Frey laughed. "He needs me," he muttered. "They always need me." But Robb didn't come to treat, he came to punish. One night the waters of the Trident turned red. The next morning, Frey heads floated downriver. Then the fires began. No siege towers, no battering rams, just snow and fire and 1,000 men chanting in the night. Blood for the trees, justice for the wolf. When the gates finally opened, the castle was abandoned. Only one Frey remained, bound, blinded, hand hanging upside down from a weirwood sapling planted in the center of the great hall. The North didn't spare. They didn't negotiate. They purged. News spread like sickness. The South began to panic. Lords who had remained neutral were now faced with two options: kneel to a king or bow before a god. House Hightower sent emissaries bearing gold and false smiles. They never returned. In Old Town, the Meisters convened in secret. "This is heresy," Archmaester Valen spat. "Worship through blood and trees? The North has gone mad." But others were silent, because the magic they once thought extinct, the old powers, the blood rites, the dreams had returned, and no one, not even the Citadel, could control it. Meanwhile, in the Vale, Lady Arryn refused to choose sides, but her son, Robin, began waking from his fits, screaming about wolves in the sky and fathers burning in gold. He drew direwolves in ash across the Ares marble, and when a storm caved in one of the mountain passes, killing a convoy of goldcloaks headed north, no one called it coincidence. Back at Riverrun, Catelyn Stark watched her son preside over what he now called the courts of the Father. It wasn't justice, it was judgment. He listened to accusations not like a king, but like a vessel. A whisperer stood beside him, an old woman with eyes as pale as ice and no name. She claimed to be a child of the forest. She never spoke. But when she placed her hand on a man's head, he confessed. Sometimes he begged for mercy. Sometimes he thanked her as the executioner drew his blade. Catelyn begged Robb to stop. "This isn't our way," she pleaded. "This isn't your way." Robb looked at her. "My way died when Father did. This is his way now." She wanted to slap him, to shake the boy she raised back to the surface. But she couldn't, because in the silence of the night she knelt before the heart tree too. And sometimes she heard Ned's voice. The Lannisters began to fracture. Tyrion drank more. He stopped making jokes. "They're not here for the throne," he told Varys. "They're here to avenge something that cannot be undone." Joffrey ordered new statues of himself built, one in gold, one in marble, and one in wildfire. He was losing his mind, and everyone knew it. Sansa, still trapped in King's Landing, began hearing the rumors. Northern priests with bloody eyes, shrines of bone, people screaming Ned's name in foreign cities, and she began to smile. Small, quiet smiles. But smiles because for the first time, her father's name was no longer cursed. It was sacred. Back in the north, the true heart of the movement stirred. Deep in the woods near the Shadow Tower, the free folk began seeing things, trees moving when there was no wind, animals frozen with eyes wide open. And one night a young wildling girl ran into the dark, claiming she heard a king speaking through the roots. They found her days later. Eyes white, mouth open, she whispered, "The wolf god is watching," and then she died. Our Jon Snow, bound by the oath of the Watch, began writing letters. He wrote to Sam, to Robb, even to Stannis, but none of the letters calmed what he felt stirring beneath his skin. The Watch was supposed to be neutral, but the North wasn't neutral anymore. It was a living, breathing god, and it wanted its children back. Tormund Giantsbane, upon seeing Jon during one of the rare peace meetings, said, "You smell different, Snow." Jon raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Tormund shrugged. "Like winter, but not the kind we fear. The kind that fights back." Meanwhile, Melisandre stood before her fires and saw only snow. It wasn't darkness. It wasn't ash, it was snow. And red eyes in the trees. She tried to pray, but her voice faltered, because the flames no longer answered. And somewhere in the north, where even ravens refused to fly, Bran Stark touched the oldest root of the oldest tree and whispered, "Remember, all of Westeros felt it, not in words, but in the air, in the frost that refused to melt, in the silence of the gods, because this wasn't war anymore. This was reckoning, and the dead weren't sleeping. They were marching. They were marching." Bran's dreams were no longer dreams. They were doors! He didn't walk through them. He slipped like falling into a river made of memory and blood. Sometimes he was his father, standing in the dungeons of King's Landing. Sometimes he was a wolf, teeth soaked in crimson. And other times he was the tree itself, its roots tangled around bones, its sap pulsing with the rage of 1,000 winters. He saw Robb, his brother, standing in snow, speaking words not taught by meisters, but whispered by winds older than fire. Bran didn't understand it all. But he knew one thing. Ned Stark's death had changed more than the fate of a kingdom. It had awakened something ancient, and it was flowing through the veins of the north like frostfire, and it was spreading. At the Twins, House Frey received no raven, only silence. They expected Robb would march south and beg for the crossing. Instead, his army encircled them silently, like wolves around an old stag. Walder Frey laughed. "He needs me," he muttered. "They always need me." But Robb didn't come to treat, he came to punish. One night the waters of the Trident turned red. The next morning Frey heads floated downriver. Then the fires began. No siege towers, no battering rams. Just snow and fire and 1,000 men chanting in the night. Blood for the trees, justice for the wolf. When the gates finally opened, the castle was abandoned. Only one Frey remained, bound, blinded, hand hanging upside down from a weirwood sapling planted in the center of the great hall. The North didn't spare. They didn't negotiate. They purged. News spread like sickness. The South began to panic. Lords who had remained neutral were now faced with two options: kneel to a king or bow before a god. House Hightower sent emissaries bearing gold and false smiles. They never returned. In Old Town, the Meisters convened in secret. "This is heresy," Archmaester Valen spat. "Worship through blood and trees? The North has gone mad." But others were silent, because the magic they once thought extinct, the old powers, the blood rites, the dreams had returned, and no one, not even the Citadel, could control it. Meanwhile, in the Vale, Lady Arryn refused to choose sides, but her son, Robin, began waking from his fits screaming about wolves in the sky and fathers burning in gold. He drew direwolves in ash across the Ares marble, and when a storm caved in one of the mountain passes, killing a convoy of gold cloaks headed north, no one called it coincidence. Back at Riverrun, Catelyn Stark watched her son preside over what he now called the courts of the father. It wasn't justice, it was judgment. He listened to accusations not like a king, but like a vessel. A whisperer stood beside him, an old woman with eyes as pale as ice and no name. She claimed to be a child of the forest. She never spoke. But when she placed her hand on a man's head, he confessed. Sometimes he begged for mercy. Sometimes he thanked her as the executioner drew his blade. Catelyn begged Robb to stop. "This isn't our way," she pleaded. "This isn't your way." Robb looked at her. "My way died when father did. This is his way now." She wanted to slap him, to shake the boy she raised back to the surface. But she couldn't, because in the silence of the night she knelt before the heart tree too. And sometimes she heard Ned's voice. The Lannisters began to fracture. Tyrion drank more. He stopped making jokes. "They're not here for the throne," he told Varys. "They're here to avenge something that cannot be undone." Joffrey ordered new statues of himself built, one in gold, one in marble, and one in wildfire. He was losing his mind, and everyone knew it. Sansa, still trapped in King's Landing, began hearing the rumors. Northern priests with bloody eyes, shrines of bone, people screaming Ned's name in foreign cities, and she began to smile. Small, quiet smiles. But smiles because for the first time, her father's name was no longer cursed. It was sacred. Back in the north, the true heart of the movement stirred. Deep in the woods near the Shadow Tower, the free folk began seeing things, trees moving when there was no wind, animals frozen with eyes wide open. And one night a young wildling girl ran into the dark, claiming she heard a king speaking through the roots. They found her days later. Eyes white, mouth open, she whispered, "The wolf god is watching," and then she died, our Jon Snow, bound by the oath of the watch. Began writing letters. He wrote to Sam, to Robb, even to Stannis, but none of the letters calmed what he felt stirring beneath his skin. The watch was supposed to be neutral, but the North wasn't neutral anymore. It was a living, breathing god, and it wanted its children back. Tormund Giantsbane, upon seeing Jon during one of the rare peace meetings, said, "You smell different, Snow." Jon raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Tormund shrugged. "Like winter, but not the kind we fear. The kind that fights back." Meanwhile, Melisandre stood before her fires and saw only snow. It wasn't darkness. It wasn't ash, it was snow. And red eyes in the trees. She tried to pray, but her voice faltered, because the flames no longer answered, and somewhere in the north, where even ravens refused to fly, Bran Stark touched the oldest root of the oldest tree and whispered, "Remember, all of Westeros felt it, not in words, but in the air, in the frost that refused to melt, in the silence of the gods, because this wasn't war anymore. This was reckoning, and the dead weren't sleeping. They were marching. They were marching." The reckoning came not with horns or banners, but with silence. In the quiet corners of Westeros, candles began to flicker for no reason. Cold air crept into summer rooms. Lords who had never bent the knee to any Stark found their dreams invaded. Visions of wolves walking through snow-drenched godswoods, eyes like red moons, fangs dripping not blood, but memory. At Dragonstone, Stannis Baratheon stared into the flames and saw his fire growing dim. Melisandre pressed her palms against the hearth, but the visions were broken now, fractured by roots she couldn't burn through. "The boy king from the north is no longer a man," she said finally, voice low. "He's become something older." Stannis turned away. He didn't fear gods, only failure. But even he knew, when faith turns into flesh, kingdoms fall. Meanwhile, Jon Snow finally stood before the Black Brothers with his letter in hand. He read it aloud, voice shaking, not with fear but with restraint. "I was born a Snow, but I am still my father's son, and my father died not for treason but for truth." A few men stirred, most listened. Some, like Ser Alliser, mocked him, but no one stopped him when he walked out the gates that night, cloaked in fur and purpose. Ghost walked beside him, and behind them the wind howled like a chorus of voices. South of the wall at Winterfell the wolves had returned. Real wolves, hundreds of them, surrounding the keep without attacking. Howling through the night like guardians of a forgotten temple, the Boltons held the castle still, but unease festered like rot. Ramsay lashed out, skinning his own men, blaming fear on cowardice. But Roose said nothing. He stared at the godswood with wary eyes, and for once even he didn't trust his knives, because the trees were watching. And every time Ramsay screamed, the snow got colder. Back at Riverrun, Robb received a raven. Not from Jon, not from a lord, but from a child. The ink was smudged, the spelling wrong, but the message was clear. "My brother said the gods speak through trees now. He said he heard your father cry." Robb folded the paper carefully. Then he stood, walked to the weirwood planted in the middle of the courtyard, the one that hadn't existed 2 years ago, and whispered, "Where are you?" The bark didn't move. The leaves didn't rustle. But deep down Robb felt something answer. Bran, far beyond the wall, Bran was no longer a crippled boy. His body was broken, but his mind was everywhere. He drifted between branches, lived in the minds of birds, spoke to wolves in silence. And now finally, he found what he had been searching for, the heart tree in Winterfell. Its roots ran deeper than any other. Beneath stone, beneath ice, beneath history, and in those roots something stirred. He didn't know if it was his father, or something older wearing his father's face, but the presence was real. "Is this vengeance?" Bran whispered through the trees. 1,000 leaves trembled, and then, yes, in King's Landing the people began to panic. The sky was wrong, grey too often, stars disappearing behind clouds that never left. Crops spoiled faster. Septons grew sick. Septors fell to their knees, whispering prayers to the seven that were never answered. Whispers in the streets spoke of northern gods invading dreams, of old blood rising, of a Stark army that walked without fear of death. Cersei tried to drown it all in wine and flame. Joffrey executed anyone who wore fur, but they couldn't stop the fear. Because fear was already too late. Tyrion sat in his chambers looking over reports. Something in his gut twisted with every page. This wasn't war. This wasn't politics, it was prophecy. He pulled out a letter from the north. No sigil, just a symbol burned into the paper. A single weirwood leaf, stained with red. "Burning doesn't stop roots," the letter read. It wasn't signed. He drank until dawn. Meanwhile, in the Riverlands, Robb stood before the largest host the North had ever assembled. Not just northern houses. Riverlords, some Stormlanders, and even deserters from the Reach stood beneath his banner. But it wasn't a direwolf anymore. It was something new, something old. A direwolf wrapped in the twisting branches of a weirwood tree. Its eyes were open. Its mouth dripped sap. They called it the Wolf-Father. Robb raised his sword. "I am not here to be king," he said. "I am here because my father was murdered while the gods watched, and they remember." Now we remind the world, the crowd didn't cheer. They knelt. One by one, even his enemies feared him more than they hated him. Because Robb Stark didn't fight for glory, he fought for something no crown could offer. Cleansing. Catelyn watched it all with tired eyes. She loved her son. But she feared him now too, not because of who he was, but because she didn't know who he was becoming. He touched the weirwood more than he slept. He prayed before every battle, not for victory, but for judgment. He called his sword Silent Fang and claimed it no longer cut flesh, it cut guilt. When he captured Harrenhal, he ordered the weirwood sapling planted in the courtyard, and when the roots touched the ground, the flames that had clung to the cursed castle went out. Ravens stopped landing in the towers, and in the dungeons, they found a Lannister prisoner who'd gone mad scratching, "He watches, he watches." He watches into stone with his teeth. The High Septon demanded a holy war in return, called Robb's army an abomination, sent knights blessed by the Seven to reclaim Riverrun strongholds. None returned, and one day a message arrived in the Septont Seven Heads, one for each god, each mouth filled with wolf's fur. In the east, Daenerys Targaryen heard tales of a Stark king whose banner was carried by the wind and whose prayers summoned wolves and snow. She didn't believe it at first, until her dragons refused to fly toward the north. "They fear something," Missandei said softly. "Dragons don't fear," Dany replied, but she was wrong, because even fire knew when it had met something older, something colder. Back in Winterfell, Roose Bolton finally broke. He fled, left Ramsay behind with a garrison too arrogant to see what was coming. They died before the moon rose. No battle. No siege, only silence and wolves, dozens, hundreds. They walked the halls, entered chambers. Ramsay screamed until his voice bled, but the heart tree didn't blink. When Robb returned to the Stark ancestral home, he didn't speak. He knelt before the godswood, pressed his forehead to the tree and whispered, "Father, it's done." The leaves trembled, and in the wind, a voice answered, but only Robb heard it, and he smiled, not as a king but as a son. And behind him the North knelt again. The North knelt again. The smile Robb wore beneath the heart tree didn't last long, because the North wasn't finished. Ned Stark's justice hadn't been avenged. It had only begun. His death had opened the wound, but it was the silence of the South that made it fester. And now, as snow blanketed the riverlands and shrines bloomed like frost across Westeros, the gods had one demand left: make them remember. From Winterfell, ravens flew not with ink and parchment, but with bark and blood, each message the same. No signature, no plea, just one line carved into a sliver of weirwood: confess, or be judged. Lords laughed at first, then they started dying, one by one. Some found hung upside down in their own godswoods, mouths filled with black feathers, others drowned in frozen wells. And some, those who had cheered at Ned's death, were burned alive inside septs with their own statues watching. The High Septon called it blasphemy. The people called it proof, and Robb Stark did nothing to deny it. Didn't need to. The people were doing his work now. In White Harbor, a crowd of small folk stormed the Sept of the Seven and replaced its altar with a slab of carved weirwood. They named it the Stone of Stark. In the Vale, Lord Jon Royce began speaking openly of the old gods. Others followed. The winds howling through the Eyrie began to carry the sound of wolves. Even the bloody Dornish began to whisper, because vengeance, true vengeance, had a sound now, and it howled. Robb didn't march anymore. He moved, like a force of nature. He didn't leave cities in ruin. He left them converted. And every heart tree planted was said to bleed the moment its roots hit soil. At night, his soldiers didn't sing songs. They sat in silence around fires, waiting for dreams. Many claimed to see Ned, not as a ghost, not as a man, but as a presence cloaked in snow, eyes watching from behind the trees. He never spoke. But he always pointed south at King's Landing. Catelyn saw it too. She didn't tell Robb, she didn't need to, because she knew what had to come. One morning, she walked into Robb's tent as he carved names into a stone tablet. Lords Declarant. Traitors, judges, and betrayers. Will it ever be enough? She asked. Robb didn't look up. Was one death enough for them? He said. And there was nothing she could say because she had watched her husband die with dignity, and now she was watching her son live without it. Not out of failure, but out of devotion. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the world, Arya Stark was making her way home. She had not meant to return. She was supposed to be no one. But the deeper the North called, the more her name felt like a blade she had forgotten to unsheath. And when she crossed into the Riverlands, the wolves came, not to attack, to guide. She followed, and each night she laid beneath trees whose faces bled when she slept. One night, she dreamed of Ned not dying but watching, and when she woke, she knew she was no longer no one. She was the dagger of the North. South of the neck, chaos ruled. The Iron Throne grew cold, not from lack of rulers, but from fear. Every time someone sat upon it, they felt it, the judgment. The watching Dark Lords began refusing the position of hand. Septons lost their voices in the middle of prayers. Queen Cersei drank herself deeper into madness. And Joffrey, he had statues made of himself stabbing wolves. When he unveiled them in the Red Keep courtyard, 3 ravens landed on the iron spikes. All of them were white. Within a week, the statues were torn down by the small folk. "Even the birds mock me," Joffrey had hissed. "No, your grace," said Pycelle, trembling. "The gods do." Tyrion tried to warn the crown again. "We've ruled by power," he said. "They now rule by purpose," but no one listened. Because the Red Keep still stood, because the throne still shined, because they thought history couldn't bleed. But then the snow came, real snow, in King's. Landing too early, too thick, and it didn't. Melt Varys knew what it meant. He disappeared that night. Tyrion never saw him. Again, in the east, Daenerys finally heard the full truth, not just rumors, but real tales of a northern army that didn't sack, didn't loot, didn't rape or enslave. It converted. Worship through war, Ser Jorah called it. "No," Dany replied. "Through memory." She didn't understand it, but she feared it, because her dragons wouldn't fly north, because the fire in her bones flickered when she stared at Weirwood, and because when she dreamed she saw a man in furs, and wolves circling her, not attacking, judging. Back at the wall, Jon Snow stood beneath the trees, heart pounding. He had returned from the north, but not alone. The free folk followed him now. Not because he was their king, but because the trees had whispered his name. "They said you'd come," a wildling child said, clutching Jon's cloak. "Who did?" Jon asked. She pointed to the wind. He didn't ask again. The nights. Watch could no longer hold its vow of neutrality. Because winter wasn't the enemy anymore. The south was. And so Jon rode south, not with banners but with belief. He didn't seek the throne. He sought a father's face in every tree, and an answer to the dreams that never left him. And Bran. Oh, Bran, he was no longer Bran. He was the voice in the roots. He spoke without speaking. And when the ravens flew, they carried not letters but memory. Every branch was a page, every leaf a word. And when people prayed at heart trees now, they received answers, not always in words but in fate, and the fate now pointed south, to fire, to thrones, to King's Landing, and the city, for all its gold and glory, had never been so afraid, because the snow falling on the Red Keep wasn't just winter, it was warning. It was warning. Snow covered the Red Keep like a shroud, not a gentle dusting, a burial. It clung to stone, suffocating color. It blanketed the Iron Throne, dulled its blades, made it look less like power and more like a forgotten relic. The city below didn't bustle. It murmured, trembled, and prayed. But the gods weren't listening, not the Seven, not R'hllor, only the Old Ones, and they remembered everything. From the north they came, not with drums or war horns, but with silence. Robb Stark rode at the front. His hair was longer now, streaked with grey, though he was not old. His armor was not gilded or plated. It was bark and bone, dyed black with weirwood sap. No banners flew, no trumpets sounded. Only wolves walked beside his horse, silent and ever watching. They didn't march through cities. They passed around them, because they weren't here to rule, they were here to judge. Every town they approached bent the knee before a word was spoken, not out of fear, but out of guilt. Every house had failed Ned Stark. Every sept that rang bells during his execution was a wound yet to be closed, and now the North was here to close them. Catelyn rode at Robb's side, cloaked in grey. She spoke rarely now, and when she did, it was always in a whisper. Some said her voice was cursed, Anyone who heard it too clearly dreamt of drowning in snow while wolves howled overhead. Arya returned to them like a ghost in the night. Robb said nothing when he saw her. He simply knelt, and she, for the first time since she was a child, embraced him. But her eyes had changed, so had her hands. They weren't made for holding now. They were made for finishing. Jon Snow arrived not long after. He didn't speak of the Watch or the Wall or the free folk who now knelt to weirwoods. He just walked beside Robb like they had never been apart, as brothers, not in name, but in blood. And behind them the world changed. Birds stopped singing, the sun hid longer, dreams became clearer, and the trees whispered louder. In King's Landing, Joffrey ordered every heart tree cut down, but there were none, so he ordered wolf statues smashed. Every northern-born person arrested, and when the Red Keep ran out of cells, he began burning people in the streets. "I am the king," he screamed, over and over. "The king!" But the gods do not kneel to kings, and his screams changed nothing. Tyrion watched from the shadows, his eyes sunken, his hands shaking as he poured wine. He had once believed in reason, in politics. Now he believed in consequences. He watched the snow fall and whispered, "We did this." Varys had fled. So had half the court. Cersei refused. She stood in her tower, wine in hand, staring north. "You want me to kneel," she whispered to the air. "You want me to repent." She threw her cup against the wall. "I regret nothing." The wind howled in response, and somewhere beneath the city, a root cracked stone. Robb's army didn't lay siege. They surrounded the city like a storm cloud. No demands, no parley, just presence. And the people inside began turning. Septons stopped preaching. They began digging, planting seeds of weirwood wherever they could, in pots, in courtyards, even in the crypts. They prayed not for salvation, but for forgiveness. And in the night red sap leaked from stone walls. The old gods had arrived. Tyrion met Robb just once. He was thinner now, worn from drink and guilt. "You want vengeance?" he asked. "It's already here. There's no one left to kill." Robb didn't answer. Instead, he handed Tyrion a knife. "Then judge yourself." Tyrion stared at the blade. For a long time, but he didn't lift it. Not yet. The final blow didn't come from steel. It came from memory. As the snow reached its heaviest, Robb walked alone to the Iron Throne. No guards, no wolves, just snow. He didn't sit. He didn't touch it. He stood in front of it, lowered his head, and whispered, "This throne cost me my father." The wind roared through the throne room like a scream. The stone cracked beneath his feet, and then silence. Then the walls began to bleed. Not real blood, sap, red and thick, pouring from cracks in the floor, the ceiling, the throne itself. The city shook, and when people looked out from their windows, they saw them, trees rising from stone like they had always been there. Faces in the bark, eyes wide, watching. By morning the Iron Throne was gone, swallowed by roots, and in its place a single heart tree. Its face was not human, but it resembled one, with the features of a man who once knelt for justice and died for it. As Stark Jon knelt before it, so did Arya. Catelyn wept, and Robb, he stood still, not as a king, not as a general, but as a son. He laid his sword at the tree's roots and spoke. "It's over," but the wind whispered back, "It has only begun." Because justice wasn't a moment, it was a cycle. And as the snow fell forever over Westeros, a new age began, not of men, but of memory, and the trees would never forget again.